So if you want to write better fantasy character descriptions, stop obsessing over how your characters look. Let me explain. Great character descriptions are not about creating a perfectly accurate photograph in the reader's mind, because most readers are going to forget the exact details of hair length or eye color or whether or not this person has a scar on their left or right cheek. What readers won't forget is how your character descriptions make them feel. So in today's video, I'm going to show you 8 key principles to write descriptions that make your characters feel instantly alive. So the first principle here is to focus on personality, not just physicality. Let's start with the biggest mistake that new fantasy writers make. They write descriptions like this. The man walked into the tavern. He was 25 years old and 6 foot tall with brown hair and dark eyes. He weighed 170 pounds and wore a brown traveling cloak, fastened with a silver brooch. So what's the problem with this? Well, first of all, if this description comes from the perspective of your point of view character who has never met this person before, then how do they know this person's precise height, age, and weight? But the real problem is this. What does this description actually tell us about this character? It tells us nothing. Like I said before, character descriptions aren't interesting for the surface level details that you list off about a person. They're interesting for what they hint about the personality underneath. So you want to be asking yourself, what do you want readers to feel when they meet this character for the first time? And what traits or goals can you hint at? So to improve our example, we might instead write, the young man walked into the tavern. He was tall, but walked with a nervous stoop, as if afraid to be seen. Loud laughter sounded by the fireplace. The man flinched. He slunk into a shadowy booth and wrapped his tattered traveling cloak around himself, shivering. So here we're seeing that this character is nervous about entering the tavern. Maybe he's also a little poor because his cloak is tattered and it's not warm enough to stop him from shivering. And when it comes to those other little details like eye color or hair color, you'll see here I'm not really including it because most of the time they're just not that important. And if they are important, you can always reveal them later on in your story as you go. Again, here is the real key to keep in mind. Character descriptions work best when they make you feel something about the person, not when they're just a list of boring physical traits. Tywin Lannister's introduction in A Game of Thrones is another fantastic example of this. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West, was in his middle 50s, yet hard as a man of 20. Even seated, he was tall, with long legs, broad shoulders, a flat stomach. His thin arms were corded with muscle. When his once thick golden hair had begun to recede, he had commanded his barber to shave his head. Lord Tywin did not believe in half measures. He razored his lip and chin as well, but kept his side whiskers, 2 great thickets of wiry golden hair that covered most of his cheeks from ear to jaw. His eyes were a pale green, flecked with gold. A fool more foolish than most had once jested that even Lord Tywin's shit was flecked with gold. Some said the man was still alive, deep in the bowels of Casterly Rock. So what makes this great? Well, here we're getting a few brief physical details, but they are interesting because they hint at Tywin's sort of inner discipline and resolute strength. Then we get to these last 2 lines, a fool more foolish than most had once jested that even Lord Tywin's shit was flecked with gold. Some said the man was still alive deep in the bowels of Casterly Rock. And now we get a really clear sense that this guy is stern, he's powerful, and he's probably not to be messed with. Another great example of focusing on personality over just physicality is shown in the description of Elrond from The Lord of the Rings. The face of Elrond was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. First of all, this is just lovely prose. It's so poetic, and it gives you this really clear sense of Elrond's deep history because he's this kind of immortal elf and his quiet power. You can also notice here how Tolkien is not just listing hair color and eye color for the sake of it. He's using those as details to really evoke a specific mood and to suggest the sort of timeless wisdom of Elrond. You can really feel this elf's ancient perspective and the weight of the memories he carries. And again, that's exactly what you want your character descriptions to do. You want them to not just be a shopping list of physical traits, but rather to hint at who this person really is underneath the surface. Now, this brings us to the second important principle behind writing great character descriptions. And if you can just get this one thing right, it's going to make your descriptions way more distinctive and memorable. And the second principle is to pick a unique description angle. When I'm reading stories from newer writers, I often see them use the same cliched description angles over and over again. So we're talking about things like eye color, hair color, skin color, height, the character's build, and the clothes that they're wearing. Now, of course, there's nothing necessarily wrong with these, you can make them work, but if you want your characters to feel much more distinctive and memorable, it can really help to pick a unique description angle. In other words, find some other aspect you can use to build their description. For instance, you can think about how they have weathered in relation to age or the passage of time. This is shown really nicely in this description from Jade City by Fonda Lee. Lan stopped warily a short distance from his grandfather's chair. It was hard to predict the old man's moods these days. Call Shen had always been an unrelentingly energetic and formidable man, quick to praise, equally quick to criticize, effusive with both. He never minced words, never settled for the small gain when more could be risked for outright victory. Now, even at the age of 81, he still radiated a dense and powerful jade aura. He was not as he had been, though. His wife, let the gods recognize her, had passed away 3 years ago, and 4 months later, Ait Yugontin had died from a sudden stroke at the age of 65. Some vital aspect of the Torch's indomitable will had slowly drained away since then. He'd handed clan leadership over to Lan with little ceremony, and was now often pensive and withdrawn, or volatile and cruel. He sat without moving. A blanket was draped over his thin shoulders, despite the summer heat. The next unique description angle you can think about is, how does this character make you feel? What's the kind of emotional aura of this person? So we have here the passage where Nick Carraway meets Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole eternal world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. See how it's kind of making the narrator, and by extension us as the reader, feel really special, really kind of singled out by this intensely charismatic presence? The third unique description angle you can use is to describe how a character moves. So are they graceful? Are they clumsy? Are they very confident? Or are they very uncertain? A great example of this is our introduction to the crippled Inquisitor Sandan Glocka in The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Glocka's walking made a steady rhythm on the grimy tiles of the floor. First, the confident click of his right heel, then the tap of his cane, then the endless sliding of his left foot, with the familiar stabbing pains in the ankle, knee, arse, and back. Click, tap, pain. That was the rhythm of his walking. The fourth unique description angle you can focus on is to look at how a character speaks. So this next one is a very simple, quick example, but I think it's quite effective, and it is the introduction of Hermione Granger in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Has anyone seen a toad? Neville's lost one, she said. She had a bossy sort of voice, lots of bushy brown hair, and rather large front teeth. So, just that little description, she had a bossy sort of voice. It tells you a tremendous amount about Hermione, and it sets her up really nicely. The fifth unique description angle you can use is to kind of describe how this character reminds the narrator of a particular animal. So we have here the introduction of Lord Asriel in The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Lord Asriel was a tall man with powerful shoulders, a fierce dark face, and eyes that seemed to flash and glitter with savage laughter. It was a face to be dominated by, or to fight, never a face to patronize or pity. All his movements were large and perfectly balanced, like those of a wild animal, and when he appeared in a room like this, he seemed a wild animal held in a cage too small for it. And then another example of this same description angle comes in Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio when we're meeting Gibson, the mentor to Hadrian Milo. The old scholiast, face impassive as a stone, moved round into my line of sight, slippered feet scuffing on the mosaic tilework. Stooped though he was by time, the old tutor still stood taller than me, his square face smiling now beneath his mane of white hair, side whiskers making him look like nothing so much as the lions the Viserine kept in her menagerie. I especially like this simile because this image of a trapped lion is very appropriate for Gibson. Again, he's sort of serving as a mentor figure to Hadrian, but you get the sense that most people don't think he is that dangerous or that potent because he's kind of metaphorically kept in a zoo here. But we also get a sense that deep down, just like a captive lion, he might actually be really dangerous and really pivotal. So those 5 things I just described there, they're really just starting points, and I really encourage you to think about other unique description angles that you can use yourself. The third principle for writing great fantasy character descriptions is going to remove a lot of pressure you might feel about getting your descriptions right, and it is to give yourself a dedicated description editing pass. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's something that trips up a lot of newer writers. They think that they have to get their character descriptions absolutely perfect in the first draft. You do not. When I'm writing my first drafts, I often leave my character descriptions extremely sparse. Even though I outline my stories quite extensively, I might not really have a full understanding of this character until I've got the whole story down on the page. And I find this is especially the case for my side characters. So when I'm revising, I actually have a dedicated editing pass where I just focus on improving my character descriptions. I might actually spend a couple of days on this. For instance, when I was editing Kingdom of Dragons over here, I realized that Master Withers, who is a ranger who is training one of my protagonists at the start of the story, didn't actually have any description at all when we first met her. So what I did is I added the following lines. Master Withers crouched behind them with a frown stretched over her tanned, leathery face. The grey-haired ranger was small and wiry, with sinewy muscles from decades of fieldwork. A fierce, probing intensity shone in her eyes. Zora had lost track of all the errors that unblinking gaze had identified during her training. So you can see here, it's only a few sentences, but we quickly get a sense of Withers' experience, her gruffness, and her competence. By having a dedicated character description editing pass, it allows you to just really focus on making your characters come alive, especially your side characters, without having to worry about all the other aspects and elements of your story. Now, speaking of editing passes, this actually brings me to the sponsor of today's video, ProWritingAid. ProWritingAid is an editing toolkit that I've used since 2016 to improve my writing. I like to use it during my editing process because they have all these amazing writing reports that let you spot things like adverbs, passive voice, sticky sentences, cliches, and much more, along with, of course, helping you to improve your grammar and your spelling. So along with having a dedicated character description editing pass, I also have editing passes built around these different writing reports. For instance, I'll usually have an adverb reduction pass where I'll go through my manuscript and try to reduce the amount of adverbs I'm using. Why is that important to me? Well, an adverb is a word that's used to describe or modify another word. Words like quickly, extremely, very, and completely are all adverbs. And when you find yourself using an adverb, you can almost always change it to a stronger verb. So instead of she ran quickly, you can write she sprinted. ProWritingAid makes it easy to identify and fix your adverbs with its inbuilt report, and that is just one of the many reports they have. The program works in whatever app you like to write with, so if you want to join the millions of writers who have used ProWritingAid to improve their stories, you can use my link in the description for a 20% discount. Thanks again to ProWritingAid for sponsoring this video. Okay, so principle 4 to write great fantasy character descriptions is to filter through your character's perspective. When you do this, your descriptions are going to take on a kind of double duty. You're going to be telling us, 1, about the character who is being observed, and 2, about the character who is doing that observing. For example, let's say you've got 2 main point of view characters in your novel, Lady Cordelia and Captain Thane. Let's imagine that they are both describing a sorceress who is arriving at a ball. Here is how Cordelia approaches this. The sorceress glided through the ballroom doors, wearing a dress of midnight blue velvet. Her clothes were cut in the old imperial style. Only the highest ranking court mages were permitted such ceremonial robes. Those weren't glass beads glittering at her throat, but genuine star sapphires, each one worth a small fortune. Her circlet was delicate platinum work, probably crafted by the royal jewelers themselves. Cordelia felt a stab of envy. She'd been trying to commission the royal jewelers for months, with no success. And this is how Captain Thane might describe the sorceress instead. The sorceress entered the ballroom with predatory grace, like a wolf stalking into a herd of frightened sheep. Around the ballroom, the pleasant hum of conversation died. Guests bowed with stiff formality and muttered nervous greetings as she swept past. Thane frowned. The collective unease was obvious. This sorceress hadn't been on tonight's guest list. Thane's hand drifted for the reassuring hilt of his sword, but of course he was unarmed. The damned guards had made sure of that. Grimacing, he checked the exits again. Why had the sorceress come tonight? So you can see here, it's the same secondary character, but we end up with 2 completely different descriptions. You get a sense that Cordelia cares a lot about wealth, about status, appearance, the clothes someone's wearing, whereas you see that Thane is a lot more paranoid. He really cares about whether someone is dangerous or whether he's going to have to get into a fight. Both descriptions tell you a tremendous amount about the character who is actually doing the describing. So when it comes to writing your own character descriptions, you want to ask yourself, what does my point of view character notice first? What does my point of view character notice that other characters might not notice? And then how do I use that to reveal something about my character's own personality? The 5th big principle to think about when it comes to writing better character descriptions is to drip feed details through action. You might be thinking that you need to describe everything about your character the first time we meet them. But you do not need to do this, and in any case, that would probably be a bad idea for you. If you try to describe every single detail of your character the first time we meet them, we're just going to get overwhelmed. And that is why you're much better off drip feeding the details about this character naturally through your story as your story unfolds. And you're going to do that in combination with action. So if your character is unusually tall, show them ducking through doorways or other characters craning their necks to look up at them. And every time you do this, every time it comes up in this natural, subtle way, it reinforces this character trait without feeling forced. To give another example here, if your character is missing a finger, don't just tell us once. Show them fumbling with buttons, struggling to grip a weapon properly, or maybe hiding their hand when they're meeting someone they want to impress. Each time it comes up, it deepens the detail even further. And it's also worth noting, you are also allowed to reveal completely new character description details later in your story, especially if they're details that wouldn't have been easy for someone else to notice at first. So for example, maybe your character has a scar on their chest, and it's hidden most of the time, but in a really quiet, intimate moment with her love interest, he sees the scar and we learn the tragic story behind how she got this wound. Now, of course, there is one important caveat with this. Be careful to not contradict your reader's existing mental picture by introducing radical new details. So let's say we're in a culture where basically everyone has black or brown hair. If you suddenly reveal 3/4 of the way through your book that your protagonist has flaming red hair without ever having mentioned it before, it's going to shatter the reader's immersion. Unusual details like that, these sort of standout details, they should be mentioned early on. And this brings me to the sixth big principle to think about when it comes to writing better character descriptions, which is to emphasize what's distinctive. You don't need to tell readers things that they are going to assume by default. If your character is average height, we don't need to know. If your character has 2 eyes, we don't need to know. But if your character has 3 eyes in a world where everyone else has 2 eyes, or they have wings sprouting from their back, then tell us, because that is something that is interesting and distinctive. You want to focus on what sets your character apart. And in fact, I find that you can often lean slightly towards caricature, not in the sense of being silly or stupid, but in the sense of using very strong and memorable strokes that make your characters feel instantly distinctive. When you do this, you often only need 1 or maybe 2 details to really make your characters feel alive. J.K. Rowling is a master of this. Take this description of Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. Notice how we're kind of leaning into exaggerated, almost caricature-like details to make them memorable. Mrs. Dursley doesn't just have a long neck, she uses it to spy on her neighbours, and that perfectly sets up her very nosy, her very judgmental personality. So again, when you're picking physical traits to describe, see if you can use them to hint at who your character is on the inside. The seventh big principle to think about here when it comes to writing your descriptions is to weight description according to the importance of your characters. How much you describe a character should generally match how important they are. So if a disposable messenger character runs into a room to deliver a line of dialogue and then vanishes forever, we don't need 5 paragraphs describing his appearance. But if this character is going to be important, if they're going to be a key friend, a rival, a lover, a mentor, or something else like this, then you generally want that first impression to be really vivid, memorable, and interesting. However, I know what you're thinking right now, and you are correct. You can also play with this as well. For instance, you might have a character who doesn't really get much of a description at the start, so they don't really stand out, and then later in your story, you reveal them to be the master villain. Or you might do the opposite. You might lavishly describe this grand and heroic warrior for a whole page, making them seem really glorious and really important, and then they just die straight away on the next page as soon as the battle begins. So you can see there, even the length of your description can be a really great tool to control reader expectations and then subvert that later on. Now, the next key principle will help you fix a very common problem that a lot of writers struggle with. And so this principle is just about how you describe your point of view character effectively. When you're writing in first person or third person perspective, where we're supposed to be really firmly within your character's sort of sensory experience, seeing the world through their eyes, it can sometimes feel difficult to know, how do I actually describe my point of view character themselves? A lot of writers will use the cliched method of having your character look in a mirror. That can work, but it is a cliche for a reason, and it often feels lazy. So, what can you do instead? Well, there's three main techniques that I find useful here. And the first one is to use comparison. So look at this description from Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchio. My brother appeared, grinning his lupine grin. Crispin was everything I was not, tall where I was short, strongly built where I was thin as a reed, square-faced where mine was pointed. For all that, our kinship was undeniable. We had the same ink-dark Milo hair, the same marble complexion, the same aquiline nose, and steep eyebrows above the same violet eyes. We were clearly products of the same genetic constellation, our genomes altered in the same fashion to fit the same mold. The Palatine houses, greater and lesser, went to extravagant lengths to craft such an image, so that the learned could tell a house by the genetic markers of face and body, as easily as by the devices worn on uniforms and painted on banners. Can you see here how Hadrian, who is our point of view character, doing this description, he clearly lets us understand his own appearance without ever breaking our immersion within his perspective, because he's just reflecting on what he is seeing in his brother. Now, the second option when it comes to describing your point of view character is to slightly cheat. So what I mean here is you just go a little bit out of your character's direct perspective for a brief moment in order to quickly describe them, and then you jump back into their direct sensory experience. So if we take this opening description of Harry Potter, for instance, perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Okay, so again, using comparison there as well. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of scotch tape because of all the times Dudley had punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. So this is technically a bit outside of Harry's immediate viewpoint, but it's smooth enough that you don't really mind and you don't really notice. And then the third key technique to describe your point of view character is simply to drip feed details over time. Like I said earlier in the video, you should be doing this anyway, but it's worth emphasizing here because, again, when you take away the pressure to do all the description in one hit, you give yourself permission to reveal character details gradually throughout your story. You can show these details through action, the way that a character moves, how they sit, how they fight, etc. Or you can also show it through dialogue, what other characters say to them or how other characters speak about them. Now, writing a great description is just one aspect of developing an interesting fantasy character. When it comes to writing your protagonist, there are also 10 big mistakes you want to watch out for. You can check out this video over here to learn how to steer clear of them. Keep writing and keep striving.